Good afternoon, and welcome to the Boise Metro Chamber's Legislative Update Series. My name is Tori Thomas. I am the Community and Government Affairs Manager here at the Chamber and also your host for today's event. The Boise Metro Chamber is Idaho's only five-star accredited chamber and represents more than 1,900 businesses. We are only able to provide current events and educational content because of our members and the investment in our community. Before I introduce our panelists for today, I would like to thank Optum Idaho for their generous support. Please enjoy this quick video from our sponsor.
There are so many beautiful places in rural Idaho, but living in these lower populated areas can sometimes mean limited access to mental health resources. To help, Optum and Hello Idaho are now offering free mental health first aid training for adults. Trained community members can be a potential lifeline for many struggling with mental health or substance use issues. To learn more about this free training, visit optumidaho.com.
For today's legislative update, we are joined by three of Idaho's political experts: Melissa Davlin with Idaho Public Television, Clark Corbin with Idaho Capital Sun, and Kevin Richert from Idaho Ed News. First, Melissa Davlin is the lead producer and host of Idaho Reports. She has covered the Idaho legislature since 2012. She also produces for Outdoor Idaho and Idaho Public Television. She has won multiple awards for her work, including a regional Emmy for her documentary on Chinese immigration in Idaho. Melissa lives in Boise with her husband and two children. Welcome, Melissa. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Clark Corbin has more than a decade of experience covering Idaho government and politics. He has covered every Idaho legislative session since 2011. His reporting in Idaho has helped uncover a multi-million-dollar investment scam and expose inaccurate data that school districts submitted to the state. Thanks so much for joining us, Clark.
Thanks, Tori. I'm excited to be here and talk about the legislative session.
Yes. And last but not least, Kevin Richert is a senior reporter and blogger for Idaho Education News. He is an award-winning reporter and editor with 37 years of experience in Idaho journalism. His focus is on education policy and education politics and where they intersect. Richert joined Idaho Education News at its launch in January 2013. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me, Tori.
All right. Thanks so much for being here, all of you. We really appreciate it. So let's begin with a summary of some of the unique issues of the session. Melissa, we'll start with you. You kept tabs on a few bills relating to libraries this session. Can you explain the concerns legislators communicated that they were trying to address, and tell us what different bills were brought forth this session?
There were some Republican lawmakers who were concerned about children having access to materials that were not age appropriate in their eyes in public libraries. And this is an effort that started last year with a bill that would have charged librarians and made them eligible for prison time had they allowed children to check out obscene materials. This is a bill that had passed the House but didn't get a hearing in the Senate. This year, the effort focused, instead of punishing librarians, punishing the library districts instead. There was a bill that would have allowed parents or guardians to sue for up to $10,000 had library districts not taken reasonable measures to prevent children from checking out these materials. That didn't advance past the House Education Committee. A second bill would have lowered that fine to $2,500. It went through a different committee, and that passed both the House and the Senate. It, again, would have relied on parents and guardians to bring forth this civil enforcement mechanism. This is an issue that we explored a lot on Idaho Reports last week, actually, about how this wouldn't have required a prosecutor to step in and say, enjoin the materials and review them to see if they were in fact obscene by common community standards. It would have instead allowed people to seek this monetary reward. And it was something that some people, including the governor in his veto letter, called a bounty on libraries, saying that it didn't matter, what the person's intent was. They could have tried to trick the libraries into allowing their kids to check out these books by trying to bypass, interaction with the librarians, use self-checkout systems, that sort of thing. This is not an issue, it's important to note, that is unique to Idaho. This is a conversation that is happening nationwide and has been for some time. I do not think this is the last we will hear of this in the legislature. There were a few other issues with the bill that came up in conversation. One of them was that it said that it defined materials that were obscene by common community standards. And it's something that supporters of the bill acknowledged is, even though that's a test that is allowable by Supreme Court precedent, something called the Miller test, and that's something that we have more information on at Idaho Reports Online. It is subjective, and it does vary community by community. And one of the examples that we brought up in one of our recent shows was a picture book called Heather Has Two Mommies. This is a picture book that's been around since the late 80s, and it's something that I think a lot of patrons in, say, the Boise Library District wouldn't even bat an eye at, but arguably could raise some eyebrows in a place like Riggins or Rexburg or Bear Lake or Coeur d'Alene. And so that is something that does vary library district by library district, and that brought up a lot of concerns. There were also concerns that it could affect the library's ability to get government insurance through what's called ICRIMP. Which is basically Idaho's government insurance provider. And that's something that some supporters of the bill acknowledged was a plus of this approach, that ultimately insurance companies don't want to have to pay out these claims over and over again. And they could eventually say, you know what, you have to take these obscene materials off your shelves, or we're not going to give you coverage. So again, these conversations are ongoing. This isn't something that we've heard the last of. I think that what we've seen locally in places like Bonners Ferry and the Meridian Library District is that these libraries really do have a huge amount of community support. And I think that the more these conversations happen, the more we're going to see people get involved on both sides of it. And so all of that to say, this isn't the end. Keep watching for more proposals.
Very interesting. Great point about district to district. It's always so different. Something that the chamber always brought up with Idaho being one of the most least litigious states, and that's the way that we would love to keep it. And so with these private right of action bills coming in, it was a really interesting perspective, and we appreciate the coverage that you had on that. So sticking with you, Melissa, for just a second longer, it seemed like issues related to youth were prominent this year, including the library stuff. There was also a bill about gender affirming care. Would you mind telling us how the respective sides of the debate framed this issue?
This is another issue that is not unique to Idaho. This is a conversation that's been happening, especially in conservative states across the nation over the last 2 years, and especially picking up steam this year. This is a bill that passed and the governor signed. It bans what's called gender affirming care for transgender and gender nonconforming youth. And so that's a pretty broad umbrella that covers things, everything from hormone therapy to puberty blockers to surgery. And it's important to note that in all of the testimony for and against the bill, nobody said that surgery, whether we're talking mastectomies or anything else, was happening to anyone younger than 18 in the state of Idaho. There were a few people who had detransitioned, had once identified as transgender and now do not anymore, who said that they had bad experiences with the medical care they received. None of those people, as troubling as some of their stories were, and I listened to all of them, none of those people had received care in Idaho. This, some of them had transitioned as adults. One of them had, allegedly received surgery in California. And again, a troubling story, if it's true, but it didn't happen here. A number of families and a couple transgender youth did testify to say that they were receiving the hormone therapy and puberty blockers, and that this would affect the care that they're currently receiving. I do know that the ACLU of Idaho is looking for plaintiffs for an upcoming lawsuit on this bill. But at the end of the day, the sponsors of the bill were very concerned about giving irreversible treatments to children who are perhaps too young to be making these decisions for themselves. They're not old enough to, buy cigarettes and buy alcohol, but are subject to these medical treatments that they may regret one day. And that was the main theme of the arguments in favor of the bill. There were a few people who suggested a compromise, noting that a number of studies show that these hormone and puberty blockers are in fact reversible, or at least mostly reversible, and said, why don't we compromise and just say no surgery until these patients are 18 years old. That's something that's some common ground that I think we can all agree on. That there was a senator who brought a proposed amendment to the bill that said as much. That didn't get considered at all. And so now we have this bill that's signed. We have this ban in place, or will go into place when the bill goes into effect. But I am fairly sure that this will come up in court, not just in Idaho, but elsewhere where they've enacted similar bans.
Yeah, thank you. That's obviously a really interesting conversation. So we'll see how all of that continues to play out. All right, hopping over to you, Kevin. You recently wrote about how the session left some hot button issues unresolved, and you predicted that most of them will be back next year. Can you tell us about some of those issues and how they might play out during the session next year, especially since you noted that it will be an election year?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of the biggest education topics are still unresolved and are almost certainly going to come back in 2024, starting with the whole debate about putting public funding into private education, whether you want to call it school choice, whether you want to call it a voucher system, whatever terminology you want to use. I mean, that's the crux of it. Are we going to go down the road that other states have gone down of allowing public dollars to get siphoned into private education or religious-based education? We saw a number of bills that would have tried to put those kind of policies in place, creating an education savings account, or perhaps providing a grant that parents could put into private education. None of those bills passed. They're almost certainly going to come back next year. There's just so much. There's been a lot of lobbying on this issue. There are a lot of folks passionately pushing to get some kind of legislation in that area enacted into law. And again, going into an election year, you've got 105 legislators, all legislative seats on the ballot next year. Certainly that bill is going to come back. That issue is going to come back. I think you're going to see a lot more of a debate, ongoing debate over higher education funding and whether higher education should be putting any money at all into diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, DEI initiatives. I thought it was a really interesting point in the House debate on this year's higher education budget. And you have to understand, this budget does not allow the universities to put any state dollars into DEI. It expressly prohibits the use of taxpayer money for DEI. What it does allow the universities to do is they can use money from student fees. They can use money that they receive from corporate donations and put those into DEI programs. So what you had during the debate on the House floor, you had some legislators saying, look, I don't care where the money comes from. We just don't want to see these programs funded whatsoever. And you had members of the budget committee saying, we've gone as far as we can with the budget. We can't dictate what happens with money that isn't taxpayer money, unless you want to pass a policy bill that outright prohibits DEI on Idaho college campuses, as we've seen happen in other states. I think when I heard that come up in the debate, I thought to myself, okay, that's where it's going. And I'm almost sure we're going to see legislation in that direction in 2024, again, election year. And as Melissa talked about, the library issue certainly is unresolved. We're almost certainly going to see another bill addressing library content. It'll be the third consecutive year we've had that kind of debate in the legislature. Again, I think a lot happened in education policy this year. A lot was left unresolved, and I think those issues are certainly going to be back in play next year.
Very interesting. Always a fun topic to talk about education, especially when we're Idaho. And election years are always interesting. So we'll see how it plays out. Clark, speaking of budgets, you wrote a lot about budgets this session. Kevin just mentioned the school budgets. Would you mind shedding some light on the Medicaid budget debate and why it was so contentious?
Yeah, happy to, Tori. This allows us to kind of talk about two of the state's biggest budgets back to back. But I'll spend a couple of minutes in talking about the fiscal year 2024 Medicaid budget, which really had a difficult time on its way to ultimately being approved at the very end of the Idaho legislative session. But to kind of step back and give people a little bit of context, the Medicaid budget includes funding for 5 different programs, including expanded Medicaid coverage. I think a lot of people on the event today will remember that in 2018, 60.6% of Idaho voters approved a ballot initiative to expand Medicaid coverage to more low-income adults. That was after years of the Idaho legislature not taking action, not expanding Medicaid. That was passed by a ballot initiative. And so that's one of 5 different programs that receives funding under this new Medicaid budget that was under consideration this year. And this was a fight that I think Kevin and Melissa and I all saw coming, because even before the session started, conservative Republicans and even Republican legislative leaders were talking about how this year they wanted to really take a look at the Medicaid budget. They used words and phrases like wanting to rein in Medicaid spending. I think even Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Wender, right before the session started, talking about how repealing Medicaid expansion was not something that was off the table this year. And so we knew that this fight was coming, and the 2024 Medicaid budget was sort of the vehicle that allowed Republicans to have the fight and to go after the Medicaid funding and the Medicaid budget. And 5 years in now, the state is reviewing the program, and that's also kind of why we saw it. But it was an interesting debate. The House of Representatives killed the first Medicaid budget. That caused it to be sent back to JFAC. That's the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee that writes every aspect of our state budget. They took the original Medicaid budget and they reduced it by about $150 million. I think one of the big concerns among these conservative Republicans that pushed back against it was the cost. The overall cost of the Medicaid budget was, the first one was $4.7 billion. It was the largest budget ever brought forward in the state of Idaho. And so just the dollar amounts were what Republicans were pushing back against. But on the other hand, you had members of JFAC and other members of the Republican Party saying, listen, Idaho is legally obligated to pay the bills for the valid claims under the Medicaid budget. So we can approve the budget today in anticipation of paying for these claims, or we can come back next year and take it on as a supplemental. If you don't want to approve full funding this year, if you want a smaller bottom line, they said that would kind of hide the issue and mask it. But we either take it on now as presented and approve the funding, or it's going to come back next year as a supplemental. I think 2 legislators really pushed the debate on that, including Representative Britt Raybould, a Republican from Rexburg, who's a member of JFAC, and the House said, I'm tired of hearing pushback to supplementals. And if we want a budget right, then what we need to do is approve the budget that's presented. And so there was this big back and forth of the overall cost versus the fact that the state of Idaho is obligated to pay the bills. And I think it's also worth pointing out that within the Medicaid budget, about more than 60% of the funding comes from the federal government. And so a lot of the funding comes from the federal government. And while the dollar amounts are high and the largest budget the state's ever considered, I think it's also important to consider the backdrop that the state of Idaho has run consecutive budget surpluses in excess of $1 billion each of the past couple of fiscal years, anticipating another surplus at the end of this budget year, as well as an ending cash balance. And so it was a big debate. Ultimately, the Idaho Senate voted by one vote, 18-17, to pass the Medicaid budget just a couple of weeks ago, really right before they took that recess to see if the governor was going to veto any late session bills. So it did pass. It does include funding for expanded Medicaid coverage, but the reduction, the $152 million, you can kind of look at that as state budget writers anticipating Idaho Department of Health and Welfare officials removing people from the Medicaid program who aren't eligible. There were rules during the pandemic about not removing folks from the Medicaid rolls. And so some of the reduced funding is anticipation of health and welfare officials coming in and removing, 15,000 or more people who may not be eligible for the program. But it did pass. The funding is there. It passed by one vote, and it's about $150 million. So we're looking at like 4.5 something billion dollars versus $4.7 billion. But again, this is kind of a battleground issue in our state. A lot of the conservative Republicans are going to continue to push back against the cost. They're wary of any kind of federal funding, some of these legislators and some of the strings that come attached to that versus sort of the reality check from members of JFAC saying the program is in place, we have approved it, it's on the books, and we're obligated to pay those bills. So it was kind of an interesting debate in the fact that it was so close and the first budget was killed. But ultimately, we kind of took the long way to passing the Medicaid budget. And I'd be happy to let Melissa and Kevin jump in, or Tori, if you have any follow-up questions. It's a big budget and it's complicated and affects a lot of different people. So I'd love to hear from Kevin or Melissa.
Yes, we really appreciate that perspective. Medicaid is a priority of the chambers, and so we were following that pretty closely as well. So I'd love for Kevin and Melissa to both give their perspectives. I'm sure they have pretty different ones regarding education and then also the Department of Health and Welfare. So Kevin, let's start with you, and then we'll jump on over to Melissa.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that you can't look at any of these big budgets in a vacuum. What we spend in Medicaid is going to affect what's available for other budgets. I mean, legislators love to talk about, you can't spend the same dollar twice. It's this truism that you hear around the State House all the time, and obviously it's true. I think this Medicaid debate is just heating up, and I think it's another one of these issues that we're going to be seeing in 2024. At the end of this session, the House Republican leadership held their annual news conference. House Speaker Mike Moyle talked about Medicaid, and Clark, I think the exact word he used about the Medicaid budget was, it's a monster. And it's a monster to the point where if we don't get it reined in, it's going to affect what's available for education funding. So I think that the narrow votes that we had on the House and Senate floors over the Medicaid budget this year, I think it foreshadows what we may see happening with the budget next year, regardless of what health and welfare is doing to try to contain the cost of Medicaid. And that's something Melissa is a lot better versed at than I am.
I just want to weigh in on a couple things about what the department is doing and what they're mandated to do by the legislature to contain some of those Medicaid costs. First of all, I think a lot of people point to Medicaid expansion as the reason that this budget is ballooning so much, but a lot of it really comes from people who would qualify for Medicaid anyway because of physical disabilities, long-term illnesses, that sort of thing. And some of those are very, very expensive to care for. So the department, as Clark touched on briefly, is going through this redetermination process for people who joined Medicaid expansion during the pandemic. The department wasn't allowed to kick them off Medicaid, even if they no longer qualified during that time, because they maybe had initially been laid off, lost their insurance, qualified for Medicaid, then got a job and no longer qualified. They could still get that Medicaid under the public health emergency. in February, they started to reach out to Medicaid expansion recipients, enrollees, and say, hey, you have 60 days to prove that you still qualify for our program. And if not, we're going to kick you off. And as Clark said, they do anticipate a number of those people will no longer qualify because of employment or whatever, they no longer live in Idaho. The other thing to keep in mind is private insurance companies, in the private sector, they'll have insurance claims adjusters that look at the different claims from their members and say, okay, how can we lower the costs of these bills? Is this test necessary? Or can we do physical therapy instead of this surgery? And that's one way that the big insurance companies will lower their costs for themselves. And the Department of Health and Welfare in their Medicaid department, I think, has 2 people who are doing that for the Medicaid division. There's so much more work than they have the ability to really look at and say, okay, how do we keep these costs down? There were proposals this year in the Medicaid budget to fund cost containment measures in the form of adjusters. That didn't get out of the budget committee. It didn't end up in the final budget. I don't know if that's going to be a conversation that we'll see ongoing, but we know that that's one of the things that is contributing to the inflated Medicaid costs.
Thank you all so much for those perspectives and all the work that you did to make sure that was covered for everyone. So Clark, jumping back to you, there was a bill that came through, House Bill 186, which now permits a firing squad as an alternative method of execution when lethal injection is unavailable. It also included a pretty hefty price tag. Would you mind telling us about why this came about and how much taxpayers will pay to implement it?
Yeah, for sure. This was one of the bills that I followed closely during the session, and Melissa can jump in as well. I know that her colleague Ruth Brown is followed capital punishment and execution in Idaho quite a bit as well. But yeah, House Bill 186 is law right now. And what that does, like you said, is it adds the firing squad as an alternative method of execution for when lethal injection is not available. And that's the situation that the state of Idaho is in right now. Idaho has 8 people on death row right now. And one of them, Gerald Pizzuto Jr., has been scheduled for execution, I think originally starting back since December. But the state of Idaho Department of Correction officials have been unable to obtain the chemicals necessary to carry out a lethal injection. And so Gerald Pizzuto Jr.'s planned execution has been stayed or called off at least 2 different times because the state has not been able to obtain these chemicals. There's a couple of different reasons why. Deputy Attorney General Lamont Anderson had talked about this during a couple of different committee meetings during the legislative session, but Idaho uses pentobarbital, or most recently used pentobarbital, to carry out its executions and has not been able to obtain that. Some of the officials said that because of public information laws, that manufacturers are reluctant to supply them to the state of Idaho because of a pushback. It's also illegal for some manufacturers, particularly if they're based in Europe, to provide those chemicals for a lethal injection. And so Idaho can't get them, has been unable to obtain them, and other states that have those chemicals have not been willing to come forward and provide them to the state of Idaho. That's all based on testimony that we heard during legislative committee meetings this year. And so the people who brought this bill forward, including Representative Bruce Skoggs, said that Idaho is effectively unable to carry out the death penalty at this point without adding an alternative method. And so the firing squad is what they brought forward and what was passed. This drew a lot of attention and some testimony because the firing squad is pretty unusual. It's only been used 3 times across the country since 1976, and all 3 times were in the state of Utah. Idaho has had an interesting history with the death penalty. Idaho actually allowed the firing squad between 1982 and 2009, but then never used it and repealed it. And so the law is written so that it would take effect July 1st of this year. After that point, we're going to see the Idaho Department of Correction starting to come up with the protocols and the procedures, because a firing squad would be new. The state of Idaho has never done it. And so they'd have to come up with all different kinds of policies. And Tori, like you mentioned, there's going to be a cost that comes along with this. And I believe the legislators approved an additional $750,000 to construct either a facility or a secure room where they would carry out these executions by firing squad. And so that's kind of the latest, but yeah, it was brought forward because they said the state was essentially in a situation where it could not carry out lethal injections. There's 8 people on death row, and we've had to stay or delay the planned execution of Joe Pizzuto Jr. 2 different times at this point. So that's kind of where we stand right now, but I want to give Melissa an opportunity to kind of come in and add some to that before we move on real quick.
The governor did sign this bill, but he issued what's called a transmittal letter along with it, meaning that he had some thoughts that he wanted to weigh in on. And he said that, he is a supporter of the death penalty, but he was concerned about the psychological impact that this would have on those who witnessed it, who were mandated to carry out the execution. And I think that's an important note, that this is a much more visceral, violent way of executing somebody. Not that lethal injection is always pretty, as we know, as we've seen in national coverage. There are often some pretty horrific side effects, and sometimes the lethal injection fails, and sometimes it takes a very, very long time, and people suffer in that time. So this isn't, commentary on the death penalty being good or bad, but I think that it adds another layer that some of the people in the legislature commented on during debate. Senator Dan Foreman, a retired law enforcement officer, said that, he's seen people shot and he's seen people die from those gunshot wounds. And he asked his colleagues if that's really where we want to go as a state. And so I think it's going to add another layer to the ongoing death penalty debate. The other thing I want to add, Clark mentioned that the firing squad went on the books again in 82, and then they took it off again in the late aughts. The reason they put it on the books again as an option in the early 80s was because of a shortage of lethal injection chemicals. This is not a new debate. It's not a new issue that states are facing. And this is certainly not going to be the end of the conversation.
Wow, that is a very intriguing conversation. I remember when that bill came through this year, and I know it sparked a lot of people's interest and, concern. The psychological aspect of it was one of the first things I was thinking about as well. So, wow, thank you guys for doing all of that research and having all of that knowledge to share with us. So, Melissa, we are going to jump back to you for a little bit and have you discuss the issue of voter initiatives and referendums. The legislature has been working with that for the past few years. Could you explain what they've been up to and what they did this session?
Absolutely. This is a conversation that we have to go back to 2012 for, and this was propositions 1, 2, 3, repealing students come first. That ended up on the ballot, if you'll remember, as the result of a voter initiative. They gathered signatures from 6% of registered voters in Idaho. They were able to get that on the ballot and ultimately repealed these laws that were very popular at the time with lawmakers, then Superintendent Tom Luna, and Governor Butch Otter. In the legislative session after that, they tightened up the requirements for voter initiatives, saying that you can't just get 6% of voters, which you could do pretty much in Ada and Canyon counties without ever having to leave the Treasure Valley. You have to go to 18 of Idaho's 35 legislative districts and get 6% of voters there. So a few years later, fast forward, Reclaim Idaho and the proponents of historic horse racing were both able to get initiatives on the ballot for the 2018 general election. Proposition 1, the historic horse racing, failed narrowly. Proposition 2 Medicaid expansion, I think I said that right. Medicaid expansion, as we know, passed in November 2018, much to the chagrin of many of the Republican lawmakers for reasons that we've already touched on. So a few years later, lawmakers in 2021 pass a bill that would require signature gatherers to get 6% of voters to sign on from all 35 legislative districts, every single one that Idaho has. It passed the House, passed the Senate. The governor signed it, but had a lot of reservations about his signature and said he didn't think it was constitutional. It almost read more like a veto letter than an approval. Ultimately, he was right, and the Supreme Court overturned it and said, this is unconstitutional, and it went back to the 18 legislative districts. We get to this session and lawmakers say, okay, if you say it's unconstitutional, we'll change the Constitution to make it constitutional. The Senate joint resolution would have put on the ballot for November 2024 a change to the Constitution to require 6% of voters from all 35 legislative districts in Idaho. It passes the Senate. It fails to pass the House by the 2/3 majority required to get a constitutional ballot change on a general election ballot. But there's a caveat to this. If it was 8 votes short of that 2/3 threshold, and some of the people who voted no said they actually supported the idea of the bill, but the resolution, but they didn't like the wording. They thought it was unclear whether it would have been 6% of voters in the last election or 6% of total voters who were registered in that district. There's a big difference between those two numbers. And the latter would have made it pretty much impossible to get. It would have raised the bar really, really high. Again, this is not the last time we're going to see this. This will come up again next year. They have one more chance to pass this through both chambers with 2/3 majorities to get it on that November 2024 ballot.
Clark, I know that you might have some a perspective on this as well. Would you like to weigh in on that?
No, I mean, I think that Melissa did a really good job, but I mean, I think when it comes to the initiative and referendum process, the Idaho Supreme Court said this is a fundamental right for Idahoans. And when we talk about initiative and referendum, real quick, what we're talking about is the chance for the people of Idaho to enact laws or to vote on whether or not to keep existing laws, and to do this independent of the Idaho legislature. And so that's what this is about. And we've seen the Idaho legislature push back against the initiative and referendum process several different times, I think 3 times maybe in the last 6 different years. And so this isn't a new debate, but I thought that Melissa did a really good job of summarizing it there. So I don't know if Kevin has anything that he wants to add there real quick before we move on, but I can turn it over to Kevin for a second.
Well, I just want to put in the backdrop of this was a session where we had a lot of discussion about where do voters fit into the equation on public policy. And legislators were really of two minds on this. They seemed to want to take power away from voters until they wanted to try to give more power back to voters. I mean, the initiative constitutional amendment, which I think a good chance we'll see it again in 2024, is obviously it's an attempt to limit the voters' access to the ballot through initiative. You had a big part of the whole debate over the property tax bill really had nothing to do with property taxes per se. It had to do with whether school districts should be able to go to voters in March to pursue a supplemental levy or a bond issue, which has been the election date of choice for school districts for years. Well, they can't go there anymore because the property tax bill eliminated the March election date. And we will see how that plays out. It could have myriad effects on schools. At the same time, you had the House almost pass a bill that would have called for the direct election of State Board of Education members. Right now, state superintendent gets a seat on the state board by virtue of getting elected. The other 7 members of the state board are all gubernatorial appointees. This was an idea that was part of the Republican platform last year. It almost passed the House, I think it failed on like a 34 to 36 vote. And can you imagine what a primary election would be like in North Idaho for a seat on the State Board of Education? I can't even imagine covering a race like that. But there's a good chance we'll see that bill next year. Really, one of the themes of this legislative session was the electoral process, the election process, and when and where voters should have an actual say in the public process.
Very interesting. Like you said, or like Melissa mentioned earlier, district to district is so different. So, having conversations with, so many different perspectives and people involved, it's obviously a really big conversation. So, well, our next legislative update series will be focused heavily on property tax. So we won't get into the nitty-gritty here. However, I do want to touch on this topic in respect to the legislature's override of the governor's veto. So, Kevin, when was the last time the legislature voted to override a veto, and why is this so significant?
Well, I think we all agreed that it was 2007 the last time this happened. It had to do with an anti-smoking bill that then Governor Butch Otter vetoed. This doesn't happen very often. For a lot of different reasons. Okay, smoking in bowling alleys. I see it in the chat, Melissa, cleaning up behind my comments. It just doesn't happen very often. And there's a lot of reason why it doesn't happen. I think for legislators to override a veto, especially the veto coming from a governor of their own political party, that's a big move. That's got some political risk attached to it. So you just don't see lawmakers doing that very often. But I thought this was an interesting legislative session here because, again, let's go back to the library issue. Last Wednesday, a week ago today, Governor Little vetoed that library bill. Lawmakers came back the following day on Thursday, and they do this for a reason. They come back after the governor has signed or vetoed legislation with the express purpose of being able to come back and try to override a veto. Well, the House almost overrode the veto on the library bill. They actually picked up a couple of votes from Republicans along the way, and it was closer to an override than I think a lot of us expected going in. And afterwards, Republican leaders talked about that during the news conference. Dustin Manwaring, who's a member of House leadership, is a Republican from Pocatello, voted against the library bill at first, but voted for the override last Thursday. And he was very blunt about it. He said, we are asserting our authority as a co-equal branch of government. And, he saw his vote for the override as a vote for his caucus, as a vote for the House. So very uncommon to see an override. It's been a long time. I think there's a change in attitude within the legislature about overriding a gubernatorial veto. I think this legislature feels a little bit more bold about taking that step.
Well, and hopefully next week we'll learn a little bit more why they, felt they needed to be bold in that bill and, what the next property tax bill came forward. So we're going to slowly wrap up our discussion today, but I wanted to have Clark, I want you to, discuss a little bit about the legislation that came forward this session related to abortions, what bills that came forward and what were the outcomes.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. And I want to give a hat tip to Kelsey Mosley Morris, who has been with the Idaho Capital Sun and then stepped up to a national role covering abortion and reproductive issues for States Newsroom. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the next couple of minutes is based on her reporting, and she's done great work for us and for States Newsroom in that regard. I want to talk about two bills this year that caught my attention and that caught the attention of a lot of people. And obviously the background and the context, a lot of Idaho's abortion laws were set previously. If you think about the trigger law that went into effect after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, Idaho has criminal prohibitions against abortion. Idaho also has civil causes of action. And so those were already in place. And so those are kind of two of the big ones. Those have been in place already. But I want to talk about two from this year. And I'll start with House Bill 242. And that's the first bill in the country that prohibits taking a minor out of the state of Idaho and taking them to another state for abortion care. It actually defines it as abortion trafficking in this new law. And Planned Parenthood has said that they're going to sue to challenge this. They said that it amounts to medical surveillance and that this should be a huge red flag to anybody. But the people who pushed the law talked about wanting to stand up for their pro-life values. And so that was one of the big ones, House Bill 242. It did pass, and that's the one that deals with taking a minor out of the state for abortion care without parental permission. And one of the aspects of that bill makes it a crime punishable by 2 to 5 years in prison. So that was the first bill that kind of caught my eye. The other is House Bill 374. And the sponsors of this bill said that it was intended to kind of clarify the language that was in Idaho's existing abortion laws and bans. They said it was designed to kind of protect some of the fears that we're seeing about physicians being prosecuted. And so what House Bill 374 does is it says that birth control methods, including the pill and IUDs, are not considered a violation of Idaho's abortion law and ban. It also attempts to clarify some of the issues around ectopic pregnancies, which occur when a fertilized egg is implemented outside of the uterus, or about removing a dead fetus. It's designed to clarify that and to allay some of the concerns that physicians have. But this is a bill that every Democrat in the Idaho House walked out of rather than voting on. They said that they were extremely concerned that it does not address the health of a woman, and it does not address some of the concerns in the abortion law. And so that's one that passed the Idaho Senate along party lines, with all Republicans voting in favor of it, all Democrats voting against it. And that was actually one where every Democrat in the Idaho House walked out rather than vote on this bill. And I don't think I had seen that any other time this year, where a large group of legislators walked out. And obviously Republicans control a supermajority in the Idaho legislature, so they were still able to vote and pass the law, but that was the Democrats in the House way of protesting that. Those were really the two laws regarding abortion that had kind of caught my eye. I don't know if Melissa, if anybody else had anything to add there before we move on, but those were the two that I followed, House Bill 374 and House Bill 242, both of which passed.
Thank you for that update. Definitely quite the conversation this year. Well, not to leave us all on a somber note, I'd like to kind of do a quick little roundabout question, starting with Melissa. What was different about this session? Do you have a theme for it, or what was unique about it?
Every session, I think at the end of every single session I've covered, we always say, man, that was a weird session. Every session is weird in its own way. This one had an edge to it that I haven't quite seen before. And largely it was there's always been infighting in the Republican Party. And the bigger they get, the more power they have, the more of that fighting spills over into public. But more and more, we're seeing that leveraged from official platforms as opposed to, sniping at each other in the halls or under their breaths or whatever. We saw the new chair of the Idaho Republican Party, Dorothy Moon, send out email blasts from the Republican Party's official account, attacking the governor, attacking Republican lawmakers for not doing enough to adhere to the Republican Party platform. We saw conservative groups like the Idaho Freedom Foundation attacking lawmakers that were once their allies for their positions on asking Congress to clarify immigration and worker visa issues. We saw infighting, I think, in a way that we haven't seen before. There was more of an edge to it. And it was nastier and personal, more personal than I think I've seen. And I don't think that's going to magically resolve in the next few months before the next time the legislature convenes.
Well, I think one of the themes of the session was that a lot of the spending decisions on education were made back in September, back during that one-day special session, when lawmakers agreed to put $410 million into education. They just didn't talk about where that money was going to go. So a big part of this session was spent trying to figure out, okay, we've got this $410 million. What happens with it? Well, about $150 million almost is going to go into increasing teacher pay. Another almost $100 million is going to go to districts to help them pay for classified employees. Those are folks like school bus drivers and custodians and paraprofessionals who work in the classroom, who can make more working at a fast food place than they can working for their local school district. So that's a big deal. And a really big deal out of that $410 million is the $80 million that will go into Idaho Launch. That's Governor Little's plan to try to provide money to high school graduates so they can go to community college, or they can go to career technical education, or get some workforce training. That's a big rollout that's going to happen. And I have a piece that I'll be publishing on Thursday looking at how do you implement this $80 million program, and how is this going to unfold? And it's going to unfold a lot more quickly than you think, even though high school graduates aren't going to be eligible for the money until 2024. So this is a big deal. There was a lot of money that was earmarked, and a lot of debate about where the money went, especially in Idaho Launch, which was one of the most protracted debates of the session.
Yeah, I think sort of jumping off from what Melissa said, I think personally, this was one of the most difficult sessions for me to cover, probably since the first two that I did in 2011 and 2012. The nastiness, the divisiveness, and how out in front that was, that made it tough to cover and be a part of every day and be around. But I think in terms of what was different this year, there was all this change, and we were really sort of talking about that heading into the legislative session, all the turnover going back to redistricting after the 2020 census and after the 2022 elections there. And so we've got a whole new look on JFAC, the Joint Budget Committee, from the chairs to the 20 members there. We've got new leadership, new Speaker of the House, Mike Moyle, and new House leadership up and down the ranks on the Republican side. And to jump off with what Kevin said a little bit ago during our talk, I think you see once again the legislature, trying to make its voice heard and assert itself and kind of lionize itself. And so we saw attempts to change how JFAC votes. We saw attempts to change oversight of the Independent Office of Performance Evaluation. We saw attempts to change how the administrative rules are approved. And now the Idaho legislature has the ability to call itself back into session. And again, with the supermajority, the Republicans can do that without having any agreement from Democrats whatsoever. So I think, you see the changes in the legislature. It was a difficult session, and then you think the empowerment is the legislature's trying to increase its own authority and stand up to other branches of government, push back against ballot initiatives and referendums, and fight with the governor's office. And so I think that was kind of all rolled into one, and still sort of processing it. But it was a hectic, difficult session, as they all kind of are, like Melissa said, for sure.
Wow, that's really crazy that you all had that same perspective, because you have all been in this environment for so long. This is only my third session being a part of it. And you hit it on the head, Melissa. You said every session seems crazy. And this is my third session. I'm like, I think they're just all just so unique and just so insane. And
I wasn't stressed out at all. It was nothing but fun the whole session. I don't know what you guys are talking about.
Oh yeah, we had
pure fun, pure enjoyment.
Well, we really appreciate your guys' time today with us, and thank you so much for keeping our community so informed. I have to say, all of your articles and reporting has meant so much to me and helps me humanize things, and honestly dumbs things down for me. And hopefully a lot of people can appreciate, the conversations that you create and the perspectives that you have. So thank you again so much for being here. We'd like to offer a huge thank you to our sponsor, Optum Idaho, along with our media partners, Idaho Capital Sun, Idaho Education News, and Idaho Press. Thanks to all of you that joined in today, and I hope you'll be able to join us next week, Thursday, April 20th, for our next legislative update series focused on property tax. Thank you all again, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.